Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, a regulatory landscape, and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining us this afternoon, we have Alex Gunz, fund manager at Heptagon Capital, Chad Anderson, CEO at Space Capital, as well as Jonny Dyer, CEO of Muon Space. We're here to discuss the commercialization of the space economy, what is driving fund flows, and where investors are allocating capital. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. Alex, great to see you as always. I want to kick this off with you. There's that cool factor that's associated with the space economy, but give us a high-level overview of the problems that it's looking to solve.
Thanks so much for having me on the show again, Jill. And space is a super exciting topic. I think why it is front of mind for investors today is that really we've got a whole series of factors coming together. It's the hardware, it's the software, it's the interest from the private sector. And really what space is all about in our mind is it's a big data problem. It is how do you connect the unconnected? How do you increase global prosperity? And then overlaying that, as I'm sure all your listeners are aware, there is this huge shift in geopolitics. So everything that's happening in space, as well as it being about having a commercial angle, it's also having more of a military angle now as well.
Yeah. So Chad, you would agree too that defense is really what's driving growth here.
Yeah, it's a huge piece of it. I mean, the U.S. government's $175 billion Golden Dome program is a key driver of investment into infrastructure companies, like those companies that are building launch capabilities and satellites on orbit, like Jonny at Muon. And also, I mean, look what's going on with the geopolitical situation between the U.S. and Europe, and the European push for sovereign solutions, right? I mean, there's a lot of onshoring and buy European going on right now. There's $1 trillion euros of capital being made available for these companies focused on defense, and a lot of that impacts space companies. A lot of big part of that solution is space companies. And so, yeah, defense on both sides of the Atlantic driving a lot of demand here.
Yeah, and you make an interesting point too, Jonny, in your notes that the commercialization story, it's not just about getting to orbit anymore. It's about what you do when you get there. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I mean, for a long time, launch was the big constraint for space stuff and ability to get access to space. It's really kind of changed the game a lot. But ultimately, what where value is in the applications. It's the things that you're doing in space, whether, as Alex mentioned, it's moving data between users, collecting data to have an impact on a very specific problem on Earth. We really think about it, Muon, kind of working backwards from the application of the problem that needs to be solved, because that's where ultimately the value is for an end user or a customer.
So, for example, you have climate monitoring as something that you could solve for.
Yeah, so I mean, a good example of a mission we're doing right now that we think is very representative of this future is a satellite constellation we're building called FireSat. And many of us that live in the West are very familiar with the challenges that wildfire is presenting for a lot of different parts of life. And it's a perfect example of a place where this kind of global high ground of space can provide sort of a view and a situational awareness and an access to insights about where fires are, how they're moving, how they're changing under things like a changing climate. That's going to have a tremendous and direct positive impact across a whole wide range of sectors and people all over the world. And so it's this really powerful and kind of visceral example of how a global satellite constellation can kind of reach down and really improve people's lives on Earth.
Yeah. And so, Chad, it sounds like that one of the key themes here as well is space infrastructure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't look. I mean, applications and the application of space-based data is where a huge amount of opportunity is. That's where the lion's share of investment capital has gone and where the lion's share of revenue is coming from. But you can't run software without hardware to run it on, right? So the infrastructure is hugely important. A lot of the infrastructure that is in orbit represents hundreds of billions of dollars of investment over the last several decades that is aging, obsolete, and needs to be replaced. So Jonny and Muon, the team over there, is doing great work in terms of updating that infrastructure and enabling us to do things like with FireSat, this new capability that is a step change in capability and the data that we're going to get off of this constellation at a price point that is an order of magnitude lower.
Yeah. Alex, would you say that there's somewhat of scale in here at this point where launch costs are coming down, which of course would allow, more access to data and more use cases. Are we there yet?
Well, without a doubt, Jill. I mean, to add to what Chad and Jonny have said, really, when we think about space, you've got to split it into three bits. Number one is you've got to get stuff up there. That's the launch costs. Number two is you need the tools. That's the satellites. And then number three, it's the end use and the applications. And if you start from the beginning, the simple fact that launch costs have come down by a huge order of magnitude, 99% since Apollo, that's really changed the dynamics of the game here. And with reusability, with scale, this is really what's turbocharging the space industry at the moment.
Yeah. Chad, it's interesting because you note that as well, that it's becoming a macro relevant asset class as it's influencing defense, global connectivity, intelligence, and so forth. From a geopolitical perspective, who controls this? Who runs, who runs the world in space?
Yes, I mean, we've been investing in this category for almost 13 years now, and our partners have built advanced rockets and satellites for several decades, right? So we've been at this for a while, and we've seen the transformation that's happened over the last decade or so on the heels of SpaceX bringing launch costs down and bringing transparency to the market for the first time. That has unleashed a wave of entrepreneurship and innovation that is really, really staggering, right? So we're looking at $300 billion, in excess of $300 billion invested into over 2,000 unique space companies since that time, since SpaceX came online, right? Most of that has gone to the US, over half. China makes up another quarter. So 75% of the activity, at least in the private markets, is happening in the US and China. Obviously, you have to pick one of those. You can't be investing in both of those, right? So if you're not investing in China for national security reasons, then that makes the US an even bigger piece of the pie. And then, there's a lot of activity happening throughout Europe as well. And as we mentioned earlier, that's growing pretty significantly on the heels of this push for European solidarity.
Yeah, it's just interesting, Jonny, because we know that, for example, if you want to bring a grid online in the US, that could be, a 10-year wait. Mining could be a 30-year wait. And there's this push now from the administration for US first, innovation first, and leading from that perspective as it relates to national security or commercialization of space. From a policy or framework perspective, is that moving as quickly as this technology is able to be introduced?
Yes and no. I mean, I think there's a lot of places where, we can move really fast in space, and in many cases faster than we can move on Earth, right? On Earth, we have a lot of constraints, whether it's things like property rights or permitting, things like that make it hard and slow to build and deploy infrastructure. Whereas in a lot of cases, those things are not nearly as big of constraints when you come to space. The big kind of like constraints from a deployment perspective in space right now remain what they have been for a very long time. Things like the regulatory environment around communications, radio licensing, essentially, things like that, which is a very big, hairy regulatory environment. And I think we are seeing some changes there that are positive in terms of trying to lower the barriers to entry and modernize some of the regulations around how things like satellites get licensed that I'm optimistic will, again, continue to kind of accelerate the rate of deployment of a lot of this infrastructure in space.
Yeah. Alex, you made an interesting point too, that VC deals hit a record level last year. We know there's a lot of interest in SpaceX. Of course, it's still private. Do you expect to see more companies go public or become more accessible for public investors?
I think that I'd say yes and no would be the answer to that question, Jill, in the sense that there's a huge interest in space at the moment. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And yet, the way we look at it is from a listed perspective, there are very few direct ways of playing that. And investors want to get more exposure. On the other hand, though, when you look at what's happening in the private space, not just within the space industry, but across many others too, and businesses are choosing to stay private for longer than they ever have in the past. And if you look at the access to capital that SpaceX has been able to get in particular, the incentive for them to actually get a listing is relatively low, I think, at the moment. So our sense is, in general, investors will remain quite pragmatic about how they seek to access this theme.
Yeah. Chad, I'd like to get your thoughts around this as well, because you also noted that you're seeing more disciplined unit economics and sustainable growth, not just, putting money and throwing money at the cause for growth at all costs, which I think is something that the industry needed to experience, not just space, but, a number of areas in the emerging technology world.
Yeah, I mean, we've come a long way since, the SPAC craze of 2021, which space companies are really culpable for sort of kicking off that whole situation. But look, I mean, that was all about multiple expansion, right? About raising based on promise and not a lot of execution. Here we are today. So, I mean, and that was early, right? So if we're talking about SpaceX providing access to orbit for entrepreneurs for the first time, really, that happened a little over a decade ago. It's taken some time for new companies to recognize the opportunity, to build companies, to go out and raise capital, and to graduate, and go and mature from seed stage funding through Series A and Series B, and basically going pre-IPO and getting ready for the public markets. 2021 was too early for that. It takes 6, 7, 8 years for companies to get to a place where it makes sense for them, where they got the revenue and the financial metrics to support going public. So we jumped the gun a bit in 2021. I think we're seeing more interesting companies start to test the markets these days. I think, although we do have a serious situation in terms of hype, we've got some very high profile, very media savvy companies that are going public with a lot of really interesting, great pitch decks and videos. But, when you start to read the financials, you start to realize that the emperor really doesn't have any clothes. So, I mean, I think that there's still situations where you got to be careful, and where sector specialization is helpful here in understanding the real risks and opportunities in this category. But there is a ton of opportunity for sure.
Yeah, there certainly is. And Johnny, I would agree with Chad, because again, these are areas of investment that impact national security, as an example, what we're doing with data, what, future infrastructure looks like. You have to have a solid balance sheet. There has to be solid governance. There has to be proven use cases, and something there for investors to get excited about. I think taking a little bit more of a prudent approach is necessary, and something that's as critical as the development of the space economy.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, to Chad's point, I mean, I think we obviously feel strongly there is just a massive opportunity here, but it looks very different in a lot of ways than what many investors are used to, right? It doesn't look like we don't look like a SaaS business, for instance. And so I think that there's a definite strong need to have an understanding, a nuanced understanding of what things like a dual use business that have strong government components and also have strong commercial components. Those different types of customers and revenue streams look very different from a lumpiness perspective, from a timeline perspective. And then also there's a huge, I think, kind of difference between software companies and hardware companies. And I think that often investors trying to map their kind of expectations, understanding of how businesses work for software, especially tech investors, onto hardware. And there's just fundamentally different dynamics at play. And so I think it's really important for investors in this segment to have that nuanced understanding of the way the business works. We think there's a huge opportunity done right to build some really massive and successful long-term public companies here, but it will require that kind of nuanced understanding of the business models to have success investing in these areas.
And Johnny, another thing that stuck out to me in the notes that I have here, that Muon, you're building sensors that detect, measure, and monitor across multiple domains. For me, that's exciting. When I hear detect, measure, monitor, it seems as if you're going in with a security mindset first, which I think is important for companies these days, because there is a rush to get product out there in what's a very competitive landscape. But it sounds as if you're building this model out with that purpose in mind.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think the kind of primary strategy we've taken is very much sort of working backwards from a problem set. And ultimately what an end user needs is to do things like detect, monitor, or manage something, right? And so you need to be able to work backwards from that perspective and say, to do that, what is required in the data, in the service level, all of these things to ultimately solve that problem. And so as a company, we very much strategically took that kind of end-to-end view of the problem. We see that, you mentioned security. I mean, we see that clearly with national security customers who have a mission that they need to solve. They need to go, support this type of operation, et cetera. But we also see it with commercial customers. I mean, ultimately, a large Fortune 500 enterprise customer has a very particular business problem they're trying to solve. They don't want to buy a box. They don't want to buy a satellite. What they want is they want data that can drive their business. And so you kind of have to take that application backwards perspective to build and ultimately deliver to a customer the right solution.
Which is interesting, Alex, because we could be getting lessons from how to build in space and apply that down here on Earth, right?
I think that's absolutely right. And, let's take a step back. A lot of what's happening in space today, we take for granted already. So every time you're using GPS, you're making long distance calls, you're doing weather predictions, that's occurring in space today. And, you think about the ubiquity of data usage on our handsets the whole time, whether it's Netflix, whether it's Amazon, and yet there are 2.6 billion people in the world today that lack access to the internet. That's where we think the real opportunity lies when the space infrastructure is fully built.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting, Chad, if you think about it, there's a generation of people who don't even know how to read a map because of the advances that are afforded to something like GPS. But when you think about it in terms of what Alex is saying about the total addressable market, where there isn't legacy infrastructure that needs to, you could leapfrog over that and apply all this new technology and provide that type of access to those who are underbanked or don't have access to the internet, as an example.
Absolutely. I mean, look, when most people think about space, they think about the Apollo moon landings, the International Space Station, and sort of these big, grand human achievements. But it's so much more than that. If you kind of take a step back and look at it holistically, you've got launch, right? Which everyone knows and loves. There's smoke and fire. It's super important piece of the puzzle, but it makes up about 9% of what's going on. You've got satellites are where the real activity is, right? This is, and you've got some emerging industries as well, where you've got, going to the moon, and you've got logistics and gas stations and orbit and that sort of thing. These things make up about 1% of what's going on, although this is really what the media likes to talk about. 90% of the action is in satellites. And in satellites, it is GPS, it's geospatial intelligence, it's satellite communications. GPS, we know, has generated trillions of dollars in economic value and some of the largest investor returns that the world has ever seen. That is provides us with a playbook for how we can see some of these other investment opportunities opening up. Satellite communications is another huge area, right? This is traditionally where a lot of the money in the space economy has been made. We're now doing it not from like these big, massive bus-sized satellites in very high orbits that are very expensive to get to. We're doing it closer to Earth with less latency, smaller satellites that are less expensive. It opens up a ton of new capability, bringing billions of consumers and businesses online. So massive opportunity. And then you've got, geospatial intelligence, which is space and satellites, and a lot of the satellites that Jonny and Muon are building are filling in data gaps in this really valuable data set that's giving us this really valuable data about information about the surface of our planet and the movement of goods and our changing climate and construction and agriculture and logistics and you name it. The use cases are infinite. So this is where 90% of the action in the space economy is today, and will continue to be a huge driver of growth and opportunity for investors going forward.
All right. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.